Hello, my name's Lily Cho, and I'm delighted to be here. I'm the Associate Dean for Global and Community Engagement here in the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies. And it is my great honor and pleasure to welcome you to this Moving Forward webinar. Uh, this particular webinar is devoted to the theme of thriving with my English or creative writing degree. And we have just an all-star set group of panelists today. I am so honored that they have joined us for this event. And I want to thank you folks in the audience for joining us. I know that it's a really busy time of year, so we're just thrilled. This is going to be a terrific discussion. Before we move into the discussion and hear from our panelists, I do want to start by acknowledging the land that we are on. This meeting is virtual, and because we are not all gathered in the same space, I ask you to consider the space that you are on as I acknowledge the land that I speak to you from. York's land acknowledgement might not represent the territory you're currently on. I myself am situated in the area known as Sacramento, and so gratefully acknowledge that I live on the same territory as York University. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. The area known as Takaranto has been taken care by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Welcome again to our guests and to everyone joining us on Zoom and to this special event in the Moving Forward seminar series, even if you were joining us via our YouTube channel after the live event. During this hour, we will hear from our York alumni about how their degrees in English or creative writing supported their careers. These accomplished alumni will share a little bit about their experiences, talk about the transferable skills they have gained while studying at York, and provide valuable advice to you as you navigate, the next steps in your career if you're a student, and if you're an alumnus, for all of us to think about what we've learned and how we can take it forward. If at any time you need help with this experience or have questions for the panelists about content, please click on the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. And we have a whole team of amazing people ready to help you. At this point, I would love to introduce our panelists. And what I'm going to do is introduce them alphabetically, and I'm going to ask them once I've called their names to turn their cameras on and come onto the virtual stage and tell us a little bit about themselves. And so, Dennis, I'd love to start with you. Can you please join us on the virtual stage, please? Hi.
Good morning, Lily.
Good morning. Thank you so much for being here.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. And it's great to be able to talk to fellow alumni about, my strange path to where I've been to, and to basically kind of give you a little summation of my journey. I went to York, with the intention of attending Osgoode Hall, and thought, being a lawyer to make my mother happy was something which was every good son should do.
I also told my parents I was going to be a lawyer.
Yes, so I did that. Exactly. I did that, and thought obviously a good path in the first couple of years before you go to law school is to pursue English creative writing. Thought it was a great, obviously, if you're going to be writing a lot, reading a lot as a lawyer and attorney, that would be something that would become very helpful in the skills. I got the little bit of the writing bug as a creative writer because I was very fortunate when I was very young, about 14 years old. I was published by Oxford University Press, and thought a poem I wrote in an English textbook, and thought, wow, I can make a career out of this maybe, and I can be, maybe I can hang out in the realms of, maybe I was a little lofty at the time, of writers such as E. Cummings, poets like that, or writers such as Margaret Atwood or Farley Mowat, and quickly learned after I got my first royalty check of $150. I'm not going to be ashamed of that I realized I probably couldn't live on that. Then pursued my other passion, which when I was at York too, if any of you remember I think it's no longer what it used to be. This place called the Underground, which is underneath the Student Center. I was the first DJ there. I was still the DJ there, so I pursued a career in the music industry after my career at York, and ended up working in the industry for a number of years, working for a lot of the major record labels. Worked with a lot of brands such as MTV, Much Music. I worked on the first 3 seasons of American Idol. Was very fortunate to get a kind of a crazy career at that, and found my way to with the advent of digital, found my way needing to reinvent myself, because I was concerned that the music industry did not understand the evolution of digital. I reinvented myself as an entrepreneur. Started a social media company in 2004, which, if many of you know what social media was like in 2004, you had to have a student ID to have a Facebook account. So
that's right.
I couldn't have a Facebook account, so I hired university and high school students to work for me. Built a company, ended up working on an initiative for the 2008 and 2012 US elections for an initiative called Rock the Vote. Got a lot of acclamation out of that. Built my business from literally a small 6-man person to 65 people, doing global campaigns around the world. Sold that company in 2012, got into digital, have been a bit of a serial entrepreneur ever since, and have evolved my entrepreneurial skills more into the finance world, where I'm helping entrepreneurs now, not at startup stage, but at early stage, helping companies finance, develop their strategies, all because I have an English degree and creative writing degree. So
woo, English and creative writing. Look at where it takes you. Okay, we have so much to talk about, but let me bring onto the stage a lawyer, someone who did pursue a legal career. Kristen, could you please join us on the virtual stage?
Hello. Hi. So interesting to hear your story, Dennis. And hi, Lily.
Hi, Kristen. Thanks so much for being here. Tell us a little bit about you.
So I wasn't pressured by my parents to go to law school, but as early as 13, I had decided that's what I was going to do. So I was very interested and had grown up in a family with a lot of strong role models that were committed to social justice. So I have a very, very activist aunt, and my mom and dad were both involved in social justice initiatives growing up. So I was surrounded by the idea of contributing your skills to build a better society and make life better for as many people as you can. And so going to law school was a good fit for me. But when I went to law school, I wasn't really focused on practicing law. I thought I would end up teaching law. So I did my English degree at York, and like Dennis, was encouraged by a couple of people who knew about law school that would be a really great set of skills to be able to bring into the practice of law. And then when I went to law school, I focused on, and I should say during my English degree, I did an undergraduate thesis on the way that government had used law and policy to target Japanese Canadians during World War II in the internment. And I focused on some of the writing of Joy Kogawa sort of analyzing that. And that's a very personal history to me because my mother and her family were interned during that time. So my mom was taken or forced to go to internment camps when she was 3 months old and grew up for 7 years inside the camps. And so I had explored that. And then when I went to law school, at the same time, I had taken this course in Aboriginal public policy. And I was really struck by the way that government had used law and policy to target Indigenous communities, but particularly by the length of time that has been occurring. Because I saw through my study of the internment, the impact that 7 years of internment had on the community and the families, but just trying to think about the impact of hundreds of years of these same types of policies and laws for Indigenous peoples and the impact of those. So when I went to law school, I switched and I focused on Aboriginal law, and I took a intensive program in First Nations lands, resources, and governments. Then I went on to do my master's of law because I really like school. And I looked at the uneasy relationship between individual rights protected in the Charter and collective rights to self-government under Section 35. And then I went on and I did my PhD because, again, I really like school. I think I was in university for like 40 years, so I'm not recommending that to everyone else, but that's what I
You look amazing.
It took me a really long time to do all this, but and then I did my PhD at UBC Law School, and I tried to develop, advocate for a relationship-based approach to the duty to consult and accommodate, the government's constitutional duty to consult and accommodate Indigenous communities under Section 35 by drawing on 4 principles that find support in constitutional law, Canadian jurisprudence, and most importantly, Indigenous law. And so the 4 principles are respect, recognition, reciprocity, reconciliation. And then I sort of weaved through that a lot of what I had learned in my English degree to create like a narrative that shows the difference between not taking this type of approach and then taking this type of approach. So all that said, I always thought I would end up teaching law because you only go and do a PhD in law if you're going to teach law. Like it's an extra degree, right, to get to the PhD. But just after I'd finished that, I had ended up being pulled into work as the first legal director at the Indigenous Justice Division, which was a disruptive brand new division within the Ministry of the Attorney General, focused on repairing the relationship between the justice system and Indigenous communities. So a very anti-colonial approach. And it was an honor to be asked, and I was able to end up practicing law for 7 years. And then I have been pulled into the work where I am as well as the current director of legal and research for the Office of the Independent Special Interlocutor for missing children and unmarked burials, graves and burial sites associated with Indian residential schools. So despite my very clear goal and set out plan to become a professor like you, I ended up practicing law in the end in really interesting ways.
Oh, Kirsten, we're so lucky in, to first of all, to have you here, but also to have you doing the work you're doing. And I love the pairing of you and Dennis, but, thank you for the deep intelligence and care that you bring to some of the most important social issues of our time and we grapple with as a nation. I have so many questions for you, and I love that you basically fought, being a lawyer for so long, and you're still a lawyer. Whereas, unlike Dennis and I, we were like, we're gonna eventually go to law school. Don't worry. And then, so that's why I kind of love the friends here. But let me bring Tamer onto the stage because he's also got a great story about how he started and where he is. And so, Tamer, can you please tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Good afternoon, everybody. It's so good to be here and to see all of you. So I'm Tamer Brahim, and I am the director of granting at the Definity Foundation. I guess I really started my career after I had done my my undergraduate degree in English. Pursued my master's at Lakehead University with the intention of doing my PhD and eventually becoming a university professor that specializes in early modern drama. That actually didn't happen.
Wow.
So it didn't happen, but it was something very serendipitous did in its place was that I found as I was doing my master's degree, I liked being in spaces where there was strategic design, strategic thinking, and decision-making in all shapes and sizes. So when I was doing my master's, I went on to, I was the president of the English Students Association and coordinating and leading our literary magazine, The Artery. And so it was an exciting opportunity. And then when I finished my master's, I found this opportunity to work at an organization that was empowering young people who were looking for unique opportunities than the traditional educational model. They had a profound thirst for knowledge and learning, in the creative sector, but not, you know, going to high school or college or university. So it was an organization called U for Change that was funded by the federal government that empowered young people through the creative sector, fashion, film, photography, DJ, dance, and theater. It was an incredible program that was especially empowering newcomer youth. In its heyday, it was this multi-million-dollar project, but unfortunately it got defunded. And I joined just around the time that it was. My responsibility was to report to the federal government on how the program was doing all its awesome work, then got defunded by 80%. And my mentor called me in and said, we need to keep this program going. Who's in? So after downsizing, we decided to, you know, pursue major donors and design a fundraising strategy that was going to replenish the program's operational budget, register as a charity, and continue doing our awesome work. And then very serendipitously, King Charles, who the third, who at the time was the Prince of Wales, came to visit our space during the Diamond Jubilee tour. And what was really interesting about that is that he came with an influential group, a group of very influential people into our space that who wouldn't normally walk in. And so he came, he toured the space. Our DJ mentor taught him how to use the turntables, the ones and twos. They called him the Fresh Prince. We landed on CNN's Ridiculous with Anderson Cooper, like it received like global attention. But what was critical in that space was that we had the government of Ontario walk in, Google Canada, some new foundations that were prepared to make grants to organizations like ours. They walked in through our door. We pursued them for funding. I was on the grant writing side of the work, and we ended up raising another $1.5 million to keep the program running for more years. And the program continues to do its incredible work empowering young people in that space. I then got really interested in the granting side in this space. And I was equally interested in supporting work that was addressing systemic barriers, particularly for young people, and had this wonderful opportunity to join the Laidlaw Foundation in 2014, where I was working with some incredibly passionate people on addressing systemic barriers in the justice, education, and child welfare system. So things like, we knew, for example, that Black youth, you know, constitute a high percentage of youth in pretrial detention. Indigenous women are the fastest growing population of federally incarcerated people. And we also know that there's less funding that's allocated to First Nation schools. And we heard that in the child welfare system, some youth, you know, find being taken into custody in the justice system is better than living in a group home and will act out in order to be detained. So these were some of the systemic barriers that we wanted to address very critically. And so I was overseeing their Youth Collective Impact program, which was offering workshops, coaching, and funding for groups of organizations to design strategies that move the needle on barriers and priorities that are preventing young people from being well off. And then this wonderful opportunity came up in September, where I joined the Definity Foundation as their new director of granting. We're a foundation that addresses the root causes addresses the root of health, social, economic, and climate inequalities. We're a startup foundation. We're a team of 3, and our impact areas are healthy people, thriving communities, and livable planet. And so what was remarkable about, you know, my English degree is that the learning, the critical thinking in that space is transferable in understanding things like human behavior, sociopolitical climate, and then to them design a strategy that says, this is where we can make investments to address some of these pieces. And that's my journey in the biggest of nutshot's.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. I mean, I love how diverse your stories are, but also how there are so many threads that connect them. And I mean, I'm just beaming because you guys are all so cool. And I'm so happy to be in this room with you. One of the things that really struck me about this journey that you're outlining is that you've all had to carve out paths in many ways that didn't exist. You know, like Dennis, you had to invent almost everything you were doing as you were doing it. And Kirsten, like, you're inventing whole public policy platforms and programs and offices and teams responding to issues that were longstanding, but also where we didn't have an apparatus or an infrastructure within government to tackle things that are actually enshrined in our Constitution. And Tamara, the same with you. Like, you were like, how do we take this thing that exists, that's wonderful, and make it, a path and give it, a sustainable kind of life as an institution, and make it, how do you invent that? And so I'm wondering if I'm going to go around the room and I'm going to just call on you guys randomly, in teacher style, to talk a little bit about what it's like to carve out paths that didn't exist 20 years ago, let's say, or that didn't exist when you graduated. And Kristen, maybe I'll start with you, because you had this really clear idea of the path you absolutely were going to be on, and yet you kept being pulled into a path that didn't exist in some ways. And could you speak a bit to that?
Yes, I will speak to that, and I'm going to give people my first tip as well, that I think it's important to keep in mind as people early in their careers. You never know how your early relationships and experiences and interactions with other people are going to influence your career as it moves forward. And so one really significant person that influenced my career was Professor Shinamai at Osgoode Hall. He was my master's supervisor. But one of the things that he did was he had to take a turn being a professor at the Parkdale Community Legal Clinic. And he had been doing the intensive program in Aboriginal lands, resources, and governments for many, many years. And so he came to me and he asked me if I would co-teach that course with someone else he had arranged to teach, who ended up being Kimberly Murray. And Kimberly Murray, as many of you know, is a fierce and fearless Mohawk lawyer who at the beginning of her career was the executive director of Aboriginal Legal Services, then was the executive director of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, then was pulled into being the first ever assistant deputy of the Indigenous Justice Division, and then is now the independent special interlocutor for missing children. And so that early introduction to Kim, and me working really hard in co-teaching that course with her, really has led to a lot of opportunities for me that she has helped to create, and also Shin helps to create in the beginning for me. So in terms of sort of navigating a landscape where it's kind of all brand new and you're making your way through, that was really the work that was required at the Indigenous Justice Division. So establishing a brand new division when you are setting up, and others will know about this, like at the beginning of any new division or organization, there's just a few of you and you have to do everything, right? So I was the lawyer, but I was writing all of the public communications. I was doing anything that I could do to contribute to the work of the organization, because I was able to draw on the skills that I had learned in my English degree, right? So a lot of the marketing, public communications, speeches, media, news releases, all of those things were things that I was pulled into. And I was able to do many of these different things because of those skills. But one of the things that was really required in trying to create transformative change within systems, as you mentioned, Lily, that are not really set up for transformative change, is that we only brought in people, or Kim only brought in people who hadn't worked in government before. So they weren't wedded to the system. They were willing to do different things. We sort of looked at the way things worked and thought, well, this hasn't worked well for Indigenous communities, and so we're not going to stick with that. And we were willing to do that because, frankly, most of us didn't want to work in government anyway. So we were willing to take on those risks, right? And so I remember that early conversation with Kim where she came to me and she said, I need you to come and start this division with me. And I said, oh, I don't want to work in government. And she said, I don't want to either. And I was like, okay, I'll come, But part of that was about, understanding the deep-rooted problematic and oppressive relationship that government has had with Indigenous communities, and understanding that governments have not served Indigenous people well. And so in order to improve that relationship, we did need to make really transformative and systemic changes. And we had to disrupt the way that government had been doing it, delivering justice for Indigenous people, or having the justice system impact on Indigenous people. And in the 7 years that I was there, before I was asked to come over to this job, we made a really significant contribution, and it continues. It's now 30 staff, primarily Indigenous within the ministry, who have a really big impact on the work of the Ontario government and the justice system. So it's really something to be proud of. And then when I came over to this work, it was the same, like you said, where we were starting from the beginning. It was me and 2 others and Kim, and I was writing the media announcements and all the communications again. And I was like, okay, I've done this before. So just sort of taking on and all the things that need to be done and contributing in the way you need to, because the work is so important. So I don't know.
Thank you
I'm sure
so
others have.
much. No, I mean, it's so, I was, as you were speaking, I was just thinking, almost no one connects the word disruptive with government, with someone in government. Like that never happens. And so, the idea that this work can happen, and there are ways of navigating, is so inspiring and so, necessary. And Dennis, I want to turn to you because, when I think the word disruptive is used in the tech sector a lot. And the idea of the disruptive economy is something that has been tossed around for a couple of years now, but you helped create that. Like you were there on the ground, I think. So can you talk a little bit about the path that you carved and what was involved in that?
Well, since Kristen gave a tip, I'm going to follow suit. And sort of one of the things that I'll say that I learned from my creative writing degree, and that I've still to this day, I carry on as part of the way I pursue and look at things, is that, one thing as a creative writer, to some people, it's a battle. To me, it's always been an exhilarating thing, is the blank page. There are no rules on a blank page, except maybe you have to stay within the page. There's nothing telling you what you can and can't do. And I think a little bit of that, whether you want to call that that freedom, always allowed me to not feel constrained by, well, you're supposed to do something this way. This is the way you're supposed to do it. And it all and more from an ability to, I call it question things, push the boundaries. Another reason why I thought law was going to be my career, I was always that person who always asked why, question, pushed, was the debater in the family, so to speak. So, and I think with that mindset, being a person who, became an entrepreneur, was always the person who tried to do something differently within whatever organization or every career I had at different points in my life. Really that sense of, well, you got a blank page. Nobody's telling you have to do it this way. So just figure it out. And I guess, having, the mentors and supervisors and bosses at the time that I call it, they ascribe to, and I ascribe to this day, the rope theory, which means I'll give you enough rope to either you can run with or you hang yourself. I fortunately, I guess more times than not, didn't hang myself, and was allowed to discover new things and try things. I call it, I never feared making a mistake. I think when, the writing process is about exploration, is about challenge, and it's okay if you take something you've written and tomorrow look at it and go, you know what, that's not right. And that ability to have that constant process of self-evaluation, that ability to, quite frankly, not believe your own blank, is very important. And, in the process, and it's a continuing sort of evolutionary process. It's a continuing journey. And part of me, even to this day, and I kind of chagrined when you introduced us as all accomplished and successful people, I never and still do not think of myself this way. You can ask my wife, who I met at York. She does not consider me a success.
You met your wife at York?
Yeah, I met my wife. Yes. And all I'm going to say is that the McLaughlin girl. But she looks at me as, the success was me being smart enough to marry her, just to remember that. So, but if you think about it, she's going to love this recording. She's going to want to watch it later. But again, that mindset of, again, social media in the early days in 2004, I didn't fear not understanding it. I said, well, I'm just going to bring in people smarter than me and I'm going to learn from them. And yes, they were 10 years my junior, in some cases, even younger. And it was okay. That was okay, because learning is, I learned from them, but I took that learning and was able to create something to which they didn't know they could do. And I think that was the collaboration, the collaborativeness that this allowed me, whether it be in social media, whether it be an entrepreneur, and even in finance today. I'm working with so many interesting companies, which are in the tech sector and ESG. I just left one.
Sorry, what's ESG?
Environmental.
Oh, right. Okay.
Environmental, doing good for the planet. Or I just left a meeting earlier today. I was meeting with a company with a former senior executive from L'Oreal who's launching a skincare line. And I sit here and I go, all these people had a blank page at one point. Mm-hmm. They had something and they believed in it. They formulated a plan and they went out there. And it's a pretty inspiring thing. I love, and I'm not afraid to say that, most of the time I'm not the smartest person in the room, and that's okay, because I know that, that the role that I'm playing to help them, it's a collaborative thing. And I think I've learned from so many people, and, and sometimes I'm surprised that some people have taken some knowledge from me. So I think it's just an amazing thing.
Oh, this is so great. And I love that there's a York meet cute that was embedded into the answer. And now I feel like we have to collect all the meet cutes from all of our alumni. That's a different project. But that's, I think, I love that, we start from the blank page and then we think about what happens within that space. And Tamer, you've done that in all these different ways. So I wonder if I could ask you to speak then about what it's been like for you to carve a path that really didn't exist 20 years ago. I know that we've talked before about activist philanthropy, which again, I really just don't think was a thing. Like, I could be wrong, but I just don't think it existed 2 decades ago. I think the scene, the sector in terms of philanthropy is so different, and you've been part of that transformation. So tell us more about all of that.
Yeah, and I think and you're absolutely right, Lily. And I think what's really interesting about philanthropy, when people think about traditional settler philanthropy, if in their free time people are thinking about foundations,
people think about it all the time.
It's like, that one foundation during lunch, it's all I can think about right now. But when you think about it, when you go to hospitals and universities, you see like Very Hall, that was part of of a philanthropic contribution. You go to there's the like Peter Gilligan funds a wing at a hospital. We think about it in a very traditional setting where it's people write checks. It goes to a wing at a hospital, a library at a university, and that's it. The face of philanthropy is changing significantly because of social justice advocates that are trying to decolonize it. And when I say that, when I say that, I mean ceding power, giving the money to people with lived experience to address systemic barriers. So it's no longer about charity. The subject is now about justice. So, and what's really interesting, Dennis talks about, getting excited about, a blank sheet of paper. I've worked with a lot of people that have been excited about a blank sheet of paper, and it's turned into some of the most fruitful, inspiring projects that Canada has ever seen. I was just on the phone this morning with one of my colleagues who was one of the founding members of the Foundation for Black Communities. And it is a foundation that recently published a report during the pandemic that talked about pennies on the dollar go towards Black-led organizations. Black-led organizations don't have access to capital. They don't have access to philanthropic dollars. And he wanted to start a foundation that was focused on that. It was a blank sheet of paper. with allies and social justice advocates that were really spearheading this work. Last week, the federal government announced a $200 million contribution to foundations for Black communities. And this is a milestone piece of work that's happening. There is now work that's happening at the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund, another foundation that was established to support Indigenous communities connect with land, culture, and community on Indigenous peoples' terms and decision-making practices. So it's not just about cutting a check. It's about understanding the priority and making an investment in something that is going to see meaningful change in communities. And it starts with it starts with a blank sheet of paper. I mean, if we were, going back to, how I'm able to do this work with my English degree, if English literature, and I talked about this last time I was invited to be part of the panels, that, English literature is a lens into culture and human behavior. That's what it is. Okay. If you think about, post-colonial literature, and studying post-colonial literature.
It's one of my home fields, so that's why I had to clutch my heart.
and I'm so thrilled, to hear that, Lily, because there's transferable knowledge in that space in the philanthropy. If we're talking about independence, immigration, and identity, that's the focus of philanthropy right now. There is a bridge between those two pieces. I think, that's really ultimately the shifting paradigm. There's now strategic philanthropy courses at McMaster. There's courses in Carleton, really trying to look at this sector that was considered a place of privilege and power, and now handing that over to people with lived experience that understand the needs of community and can benefit from granting dollars to do some of that extraordinary work.
I mean, that's so amazing. I don't know how many of you guys encountered this line where, anytime as an undergraduate, I told people what my major was, they would, it was always like, what are you going to do with that, teach? and when I did something, when I said, well, I'm really, really passionate about post-colonial literature, people, there was just this sort of blank kind of response, and it's so inspiring to hear all three of you talk about the ways in which courses you studied, texts you looked at, specific professors you've had have been so important and transformative in terms of the world that you're in now, which seems, I just remember what it was like to be an undergraduate. The grown-up world seems so far away. But what's so amazing is to know that, in fact, there are these really direct connections, between what you've done and Rock the Vote and activists and decolonial philanthropy and the incredibly important work that's happening in terms of redress and reconciliation in Kristen's field. And so I'm just in awe of the work you're all doing, and I'm so grateful to be hearing about it. I'm going to ask a couple more little questions, but I also want to let the folks in our audience know that we are happy to take questions. If you've got questions for our audience, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A, and I'll moderate and mediate. We'll try to get to questions. We also have some questions that were submitted in advance by our audience, so I'll draw those in too. But before I do that, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about risk and the idea of risk, because it seems to me that you've all taken some real risks. and so I wonder if you could share an example of a risk that you've taken in your career path that allowed you to move forward. And in fact, Dennis, I'm going to start with you. Is there a risk that you, I just feel like there've been so many risks.
I was going to say, where do I begin?
Your parents have heart attacks at various moments in your life?
Let's put it this way. To this day, if you ask my mother what I do, the only thing I've been able to reassure her is A, it's legal, and B, don't worry about your grandchildren. They're fine. They're just fine. I'll put it this way. I think the one that sticks out in my head the most was, and I moved to New York about 3 months after 9/11 So to get my job
Wow.
in the music industry. So I was working for Sony Canada. I got headhunted to work for a gentleman by the name of Clive Davis, who's a music
Whoa.
legend, executive in the music
Whoa.
industry. He's signed people, he signed
Like, wow. Sorry.
everybody knows. So I'm working for Clive in New York on the first 3 seasons of American Idol. And what ended up happening was, I'm working there. I get sent to a meeting in California. I thought, being a senior executive in the company, it was natural for me to go. I did not know at the time. I found out later that I was being sent because I was the youngest guy on the executive team. And well, no one else understands digital. Dennis kind of does, so let's send him. So I met this guy named Steve at a company called Apple, negotiated this thing called iTunes.
Sorry.
So working with that, after the deal was done, was told that basically, well, Dennis, you understand more about digital. Why don't you run the digital division for iTunes for our company? And that year was at presenting the our company forecast that year, and was a real eye-opener, because what happened in that meeting was everyone in the room was talking about how many Britney Spears or NSYNC, or we just signed Maroon 5 at the time, how many Maroon 5 CDs we were going to ship.
Wow.
I stood up and said, we need to start thinking about the company differently. We need to talk about the evolution of music, how we need to talk about selling content to the consumer. Because in 1996, we had 50 customers, HMV Tower Records. Now it's 2002, 2003, we're going to have 6 billion customers. So we need to talk about how we're shifting our attitude and talk about selling content rather than these shiny silver things. I was told to shut up and sit down. That was the pivotal moment for me where, despite the fact that I had, I guess, the career that maybe most people would always aspire to, I realized that there was a concern that I might not have that, that career because of what was happening, and that how digital was basically eating the traditional market for breakfast. I decided I needed to reinvent myself, and I saw that digital was the future. I didn't fully understand how, but I decided that, I think I was 32 at the time, 33 maybe. I said, I need to reinvent myself now, because if I fail, I can move back into my parents' basement. I cannot fail at 40. I cannot fail at 50, having been in one industry my whole life, because I will not be able to reinvent myself then. So I took the leap of faith. I left a job that, I was probably overpaid at. And, when I left, the company thought I was going to a competitor and offered me more money, and never believed that I was actually leaving the business. And I think for a few years, I didn't believe I was leaving the business, and because it was a bit surreal for me, but I decided that I needed to, and found a way to reinvent myself. I'm not going to tell you it was easy. I questioned myself many times, and I moved back to Canada and did that. And probably would I do it again? Absolutely not. But I'm thankful. What I did was a choice, which I'm going to say is a combination of luck and maybe a bit of skill, and timing, but it worked out.
I mean, that's so important to, these stories are so important, because one of the things that I tell students all the time is that the world that you're in now is not going to be the world that you're going to work in 10 years from now. And in our lifetimes, we've seen these massive shifts, and the whole point of going to university is, in some ways, giving yourself the courage to reinvent, to move with shifts. And in some ways, literature is what allows us to think about those reinventions, about the different narratives that we can occupy or take up for ourselves. And Tamara, I wonder if you could tell us about like a risk that you took that really allowed you to move your career to move forward, and you look back on that and you think, whoa, that was scary, but I did that.
I think, the one thing the biggest risk I took was to, I took it like earlier on in my career. I was working at a grassroots organization that was offering next to nothing for pay, because we were still building from the ground up. But they're like, hey, you can manage this partner that we have with Google Canada. to develop a digital literacy program for young people. And then, you know, at the end of the, like, once we've had an opportunity to run the program, we can bring it back to them and tell them a little bit about the work. So I had the pleasure of, you know, going to Google Canada's office and, you know, talking to their managing director and their team and say, this is, you know, how young people are approaching us when it comes to, and this was about 10 years ago or so, how digital literacy is a critical piece, is a critical tool for, you know, prospective employment opportunities, career development, and so on and so forth. But we were, you know, we only had passion and conviction at the time. And so we were just really focused on, sometimes you'll be put in situations where you just have to, you know, listen to your gut and say, okay, maybe this is the right space, this is the right place at the right time. Unfortunately, it's, you know, pay is probably not the best, you know, it's not the best in this situation, but we'll make the best, I'll make the most of it as much as I can. But if you find that you are able to be in those positions and you think that there is a wonderful opportunity to be able to learn and take this experience and carry it forward, yeah, take a shot at it. And you can always, I mean, if it becomes incredibly taxing, I mean, in the sector, it can be spread thin, it can be taxing, it can be, you know, it can wear you out on your mental health, but obviously know when to stop. That's the critical piece. But I was able to manage this partner with Google Canada, the InSpirit Foundation. We wrote a grant once to do a theatrical production, and we got funded, and then we had to write the play. So we had the idea, and we hadn't written the play yet. And so they funded us because it was addressing interculture and interfaith. That was the foundation's mandate. And then I got a team together and like, all right, so they just gave us the money. Let's put on a play. And so we literally had to put on the play. We actually invited them. They loved it. Then they invited the media because they had media connections to come showcase this play in Regent Park at the Daniel Spectrum. And when all of this was happening, and my colleague who was the program director at the time was like, hey, remember when we had to sit down and write a play because we had funding to do so and just barely had anything? Or like, yeah, that was an interesting experience. So sometimes you're thrusted into the deep end and you have to learn how to tread water, and that's okay. I think one of the things about you know, being in school and learning is that, you know, school can sometimes stigmatize failure. And so, you know, that you take failure as an opportunity for learning. I think you'll find some golden nuggets in there. So yeah, that was the space I was in when I was taking a bit more risk.
Oh, I really want to hang on to that, because there is this idea that you know, you have to get this grade, and if you fail this course, it's a disaster. And you know, there are ways in which school is structured like that, but there needs to be some other way to think about what it means to try something, even when you don't know how it's going to turn out, which is the story that I'm hearing here. And Kristen, I wonder if I could ask you to tell us about a risk and what happened there. What was the risk that you took?
Okay, well, it kind of aligns with what I said at the beginning, that, you know, I was very clear that my ethics aligned with a career in social justice. And so when I finished law school, I was looking for articles, but I went to the career services people and I was like, well, I'm also on the beach volleyball national team, so I kind of need the summers off. And the career services
I love this curveball that you've thrown into this.
I'm like, and I know that they're 10-month articling terms, so I don't know if that's possible. And she said, well, you probably can't go with a smaller organization like a community legal clinic or a smaller organization, because they really can't accommodate you leaving like for 5 months, 7 months, come back, or whatever you needed to do. So she said, but I have a friend who's a partner at a big law firm, and his wife is an Olympic equestrian. Why don't you meet with him? So I ended up meeting with a good friend of mine still, Gary Kissick, and he, you know, was like, oh, this sounds interesting. I think we can arrange that at our firm, because they have like 40 articling students. So it doesn't really matter if someone's coming and going and doing odd things. And so I ended up getting an articling position at this huge firm. And I worked from September to February, and then I had 7 months off, and then I worked from September to February, and then finished my 10 months of articling over 2 years. But the thing that I knew was that I wouldn't like it. Like, I wasn't really interested in being a corporate lawyer, the money, the grind of it. And so at the end, here's the big risk. They came to me and they said, are you interested in having a job here? And I was like, nope. Thank you
Oh
so
my
much
gosh.
for letting me article, but I'm not interested. So I
Wow.
went back and
You walked away from a lot of money at
yeah,
a really early point in your life.
yeah.
Like, because at different points in your life, a lot of money means different things. But I would say, there are times in your life when a lot of money means a lot.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
But it ended up going back to finish my master's of law, and then I ended up having really interesting legal careers, legal jobs that aligned with my ethics. And so the first was a research lawyer with the Law Commission of Ontario, which was interested in law reform, particularly like how law impacts particular communities. And then how, to reform those laws. And so it's a very like critical theory work where you're looking at the impact on people with immigration status or refugees or precarious employment, migrant workers, Indigenous people, racialized people, and the different impacts of various legal regimes. And so that was really aligned with my expertise, interests, and ethics. And then the second job I had, and I think I met Tamara during this time, but I think I was at the Law Foundation of Ontario as a grants officer, similar to what you're doing, but I wasn't as high up in the organization. And I was managing the Access to Justice Fund, which was a national fund, and a lot of the grants and funding that we were delivering was to Indigenous communities or to support Indigenous legal systems and sovereignty. So it was a really good way for me to see sort of the landscape across the country in terms of the work that Indigenous communities were leading in the context of the justice system. And that gave me a really important perspective going into the work at the Indigenous Justice Division as well, understanding what was happening across Canada, the activism and work of Indigenous communities and all the different initiatives that were taking place was really helpful. So all of the different choices that I made, which did have the impact of me not making as much money in the beginning, kind of like Tamara was talking about, but really laid a really important foundation for me having the ability to do the work that I'm doing now.
That's a great. I mean, okay, all of your stories are great, but I'm still wrapping my head around because like there was a bunch of risks you talked about, but in a career where you originally started off as talking about it as relatively not risk averse, but you were like, I'm going to be a professor. Like you had a real path, but in fact there was the beach volleyball curveball, which is a risk where, you're trying to secure articles, but you also decided that you needed to value something else about your life that wasn't necessarily tied to the singular trajectory. And then also, yeah, I mean, I do think I mean, maybe it's the immigrant child in me, but like the breathtaking risk of walking away from like a job that was going to give you a lot of money, where you're valued, where you wanted, where there's a really clear path to promotion and entering, the hallowed halls of institutionalized, like whatever pastry is, like whatever we want to call it. But so I hope that our folks in the audience can take some of these amazing pieces of wisdom that you're all sharing. And we have so many questions. In fact, we're not going to have time to cover them all. And so, but what I want to do is actually turn a bit to the questions that were submitted in advance by some of our panelists. And one of our, by our audience. And one of our audience members is asking about something that I find quite interesting, which is a reflection on mid-career. We often talk about, what happens at the beginning of the career, but this is a question about your mid-career point and whether or not there was a moment in a mid-career moment for you where your English skills or something about your English degree or your creative writing degree sort of kicked in and started to matter. And you've all talked about it in different ways in terms of like a through line, like throughout, you've been so great about identifying where your English degree and creative writing degree has been a part of all the work you've been doing. But maybe a moment in the middle where you were like, that actually still matters. Tamara, maybe I could start with you. I mean, I mean, the obvious thing seems to be the part where you had to write a play, but maybe there's another part of this story that you want to share.
Yeah, I think the big piece in a grant making foundation at philanthropic foundations is storytelling, because that is fundamental to understanding. If you're funding a community that's looking to, decrease the youth homelessness rate, you want to tell the story about how that strategy came to fruition, how the decision makers and the allies came into the space and say, this is what we want to do, and to really tell the story about the journey from exploration, design, planning, and implementation. One group I can think of is working in Kingston, was looking at reducing the rate of youth homelessness in Kingston, Frontenac, Lennox, and Addington. And when they looked at the statistics, they realized that a lot of young people were ending up homeless or precariously housed because they were leaving home, and home was a toxic environment. So the response was to focus on family conflict mediation, and that was responsible for reducing the rate of youth homelessness. Storytelling is also critical because sometimes you need to understand, the nuance of community. And one story that I think about was told by a man that I connected with at an institution called the Tamarack Institution. His name is Mark Kabaj, and he was talking about a group of people that were looking at reducing the rate of infant fatalities and car accidents because families were not putting their kids in car seats. They looked deeper at the numbers and the statistics. They realized that it was, Mexican and Hispanic families not putting their children in car seats. So the response was to do public service announcements in English and in Spanish and to subsidize costs for car seats, but the numbers didn't in fact change. What ended up actually making a difference was to get the bishops to bless the car seats. So they found that the bishops were community advocates. The church is a place of convening, and it's an influential space. Use that to the benefit of trying to send a message about the importance of car seats. So storytelling is the critical piece in this.
I love this. Thank you so much. Kristen, a mid-career moment where English suddenly seemed to come back to you.
Okay, I have a couple, but
okay.
I'm not going to take up too much time. But the big one for me was that I really realized that I think it was also when I finished my PhD, because I was writing a lot during that period of time, not like as creatively, although I did put a narrative in my dissertation that some of the people on my committee were very uncomfortable with. But anyways, I got it through. And then I was justified in doing that because a professor later contacted me and asked if they could use my narrative to teach part of their course.
Wow.
So I was like, see, it was useful for people.
Yeah.
But some of the more traditional academics thought there wasn't a real place for that, but they didn't take an English degree, right? So that was one place I used it, and that was kind of mid-career because it took me so long to get my PhD done. But the other places that we were able to use it, I was able to use it with colleagues who also are really good writers, is in sort of illustrating the legal barriers in the work that we were doing at the Indigenous Justice Division. So we did a lot of training, and we would write a lot of hypothetical case studies, but we would use those case studies to illustrate how a particular legal issue could impact a particular person's life, right? And we know that in our work there, which was focused on transformative change and focused on trying to get government lawyers to lawyer for reconciliation, we needed to move people from their heads to their hearts. And the only way, in my view, to move people to their hearts is to tell a story, like Tamara was saying, to tell a story so that people understand that you can say a million times that there's this barrier that exists, but if you illustrate it through a story of how it actually impacts people in their real lives, then that makes a big difference. And so we would use it a lot actually in that work. And then the last thing that I'll say is that I started to get an itch to write a bit. And so I started my own little website called possibilify.com. And
Okay.
my sisters and I do it together. And my idea was that we would each develop a third of the content, but I'm the real writer. So then I realized, see, I have to develop like 95%, and then once in a while they'll throw an article in because, but it's been really fun actually to have an outlet. The only thing that in reflection, I realize is that now that I'm helping to research and write a huge report, it's hard to find the energy and creativity to sort of do additional writing on the side. So that's what I've learned is, even when I was doing my PhD, if I had a writing intensive and research intensive job, it was a lot harder to do writing on the side. But anyways,
it's so important to hang on to the energy that you need for that. Dennis, I'm going to get you to round us out.
You know, I just keep listening to everybody talking about, you know, the mid-career question, and I'm still trying to figure out when is the middle of my career. So, you know, again, I probably am going to do the worst job answering this one because I've always felt that creative writing has helped me in every stage. You know, it's again going back to Tamer's comments about storytelling. You know, early stage of my music career, you know, I was doing the advertising commercials or, you know, and for these compilations called Much Dance and Big Shiny Tunes, I was writing scripts, I was telling stories, I was putting those together, you know, I was telling stories, we were helping write, you know, and craft storylines in American Idol. You know, everything's always been about storytelling. When I raised money my first time, I had to tell a story to my investors, you know, on what we were doing in social media. And I remember, you know, talking to people who told me they still didn't understand what I was doing in social media. They didn't understand what that concept was. And I'm talking about 2004, 2003.
Wow.
But they said, you know, you told a great story. And so I got people to invest in it. And to this day, you know, I think dealing with the companies I deal with, I'm talking to them, talking to investors and financial people about the story of the business and really trying to take them on a journey, which, you know, obviously taps on the emotional, but I still also have to give the factual, you know, the P&L, the spreadsheet, the forecasts, and be able to weave that fact. And I don't want to say the fiction, but the wondrous kind of notion of what the business is trying to accomplish and weave that into a nice balanced story, which obviously hopefully get people to invest.
I think I love all of this, and I love that you know, we're going to close out on the importance of storytelling and the way in which your English and creative writing degrees help you analyze what a story is, what makes up a good story, what are the components of it, how to critically engage with it, and then how to then, you know, develop your own. And in each of your careers, you know, storytelling has been such a powerful through line. And you know, we've had questions about entrepreneurship, and I just want to say, you know, the story of a business, the story of a philanthropical act, the story, you know, of how we find reconciliation are our stories. And that does not mean when we say stories that we're going to diminish what they are, that there is truth in story, and then that we're going to take those truths and carry them forward. I am so honored to have shared some space with the three of you. You're amazing. We're so lucky to count you among our alumnus. And I want to thank you again for sharing your stories and providing valuable advice and inspiration. To our audience, if you have more questions for our panelists that were not answered, and I know we didn't get to most of your questions, I'm sorry, please feel free to reach out to them if on LinkedIn. But when reaching out, we want you to please just note that you found them through the York Moving Forward webinar, because they probably get a lot of connection requests in a given day. And so it's important for you to give them some context for that. I want to thank you again for attending this webinar today. We hope you found it helpful. You can find recordings of this and other interesting webinars in the Moving Forward series on our YouTube channel. And I think the links are going to be popped into the chat there. I hope everyone has a terrific afternoon. I am buzzing with inspiration, and again, so thrilled to have shared some space with you. I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.